It's June, so it's officially time to head back to camp. Camp Crystal Lake, Camp Blood, or Camp Forest Green, I guess, in terms of what they're calling it in Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives, for Friday the 40th. So now, from what we were talking about last time on Part 5, this is sort of it's a new chapter in the direction of the series, and also perhaps where we might start to diverge in terms of our overwhelming love for the installments that we've talked about so far. So I'm going to let you lead off on this. Where does Part 6 stand in your estimation of the overall films?
How about we say where it stands in the ones we've done so far, right?
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
So I think it probably stands at 6 of the 6 that we've done.
Wow.
Yeah. So, look, I mean, this is a movie that a lot of people find like beloved in some ways, and has a pretty good reputation in the circles of Friday the 13th lore, and in many ways was considered a return, or another turn. Maybe another turn is a better way to say it in the franchise, given that we had exhausted kind of the first section, moved on to the new beginning in a way, which was really, I mean, as we talked about last month, a detour into some darker territory in a few different ways, and now we've pulled out of that into maybe as PG version of Friday the 13th as we will ever get, or as a gentler, kinder version, even though we've got, I think, 16 murders in the movie, right? So I think it's a total departure in tone and approach. And, honestly, the first movie in the series where I just didn't give a care about anybody in it at all, I just thought it was pretty cardboard. And even though I admire Tom McLoughlin, who tried to do something totally different with the movie, not totally different, but a little bit different, because he injected some humor and action into it in a way that had not been done before. Intentions, I think execution and intentions are two different things. And this movie to me is just, it's pretty generic. And I just, I think as we talk about subsequent films as well, they all sort of suffer from this malaise, I think, of just assembly line killings of people that I just don't care about. Now, some might say you don't care about anybody in any of these movies from the very beginning forward, and et cetera, et cetera. But once you accept that, there are like variations in, how invested you are in them. And this one to me, I just thought was kind of silly, very in the vein of mid 80s kind of horror in terms of its aesthetic and look and feel, which I do like. A lot of the mid 80s horror films, they have a glossiness to them, or they feel a little different in terms of the lighting styles and the styles overall. So it has a little bit of different stylistic feel to it. But there's something about it that just feels to me, I just didn't care. And I didn't like anybody in it too much, with the exception of Tom Matthews, who I think is a pretty good actor in more than one movie. So I'm somewhat indifferent to this particular one. I don't think it's by any stretch bad, and certainly it was better received than the one before it. But somehow, to me, I just didn't care about it. And I know people love it. But...
Yeah, I still love it, and before we started doing this series, it was like way up there on my list. And now it's still way up there, but I'm trying to find a place for it, because you rank it as number 6, which is like bottom of the barrel, kind of. I don't think it's a bottom of the barrel kind of movie because of the ambition, because of the kind of the brains behind it. And I think McLoughlin pulled off a lot. He achieved a lot of what he set out to do. Personal reaction to it, that's a separate thing. But before we got to talking in depth about this series, I didn't really care a whole lot, or I didn't think I cared a whole lot about the characters in the previous entries. And watching and talking through them with this kind of new mindset, yeah, I really do care about a lot of these characters that are pretty well drawn for being a generic slasher series. Part 6, I did like that Tommy Jarvis came back in this particular iteration, kind of forgetting Part 5, even though, I agree that Part 5 is pretty great in its own way. But I really did care, especially watching it earlier today, about the characters of Sheriff Garris and his daughter, Megan, because unlike a lot of the law enforcement that we've seen in the previous movies who just kind of like show up, with the body bags or just show up to not believe the teenagers or show up to get killed, these are real characters, Sheriff Garris, and he really cares about his daughter, and he's, an upstanding lawman in the best kind of way. He's not just the asshole guy. He's trying to be sensitive to this crazy teen kid who comes into his office saying that he's resurrected Jason. He's like, I'm really sorry what happened to your family and everything, but you're also you're claiming to have dug up a body, and now you're trying to get in the way of me trying to do my job, so I gotta lock you up. But particularly towards the end of the movie, where he shows real heroism in going to try and stop Jason from attacking his daughter and the other kids at the camp, I thought it was really kind of moving in its own way. And I liked that Megan seems to have, for as much of a loose cannon, wild teen who will do things like, fall instantly in love with a guy who's behind bars because he's got that smoldering kind of like Tom Matthews thing. She also displays that kind of heroism in, running to protect the kids, make sure everybody's okay, and, kind of holding her own against Jason in that moment, in that last moment. So it's funny that you mentioned this because it's a different direction, and it almost doesn't feel like a Friday the 13th movie. And I feel like it does set the direction for what the next couple of movies are going to be, which is very plot and mythology centered, which the movies up until this have not been. They tried to kind of do that with part 5 and the whole like real whodunit from the beginning aspect of it, even more so than part 1. But it's almost like it's trying to be something more than what it really needs to be. And in some aspects, I don't appreciate that. But in other aspects, I'm like, well, at least it's not just another, 80 minutes of set piece killings.
Yeah. So a lot of what you're saying, I would agree with in a general, very general sense. And there's a bunch of things that I admire about this movie. Unfortunately, like none of them are on the screen. And they're all they're all in the pre-production of the movie and in the production of the movie. And that starts with John McLoughlin, who's a person that's sort of worth his salt as a filmmaker. I mean, he's somebody who, is not a slouch. He wasn't some schlock director for hire that came on and decided to just take one for the team by doing a Friday the 13th movie. This is a guy who grew up in and around the movie industry, on the backlots of MGM, and somebody who had always revered the Universal monsters, right? So he, when you talk about the attempt to do something different and more ambitious with a franchise that a lot of people felt was worn out at this point, that he did definitely do. And so it's really fascinating to hear John McLoughlin talk about his influences for the movie and his attempt to, for example, do a whole bunch of things, from introduce the supernatural element to the movie, to the use of the children in the movie, which, of course, there's a moment that comes right out of the classic Frankenstein as well that's in the movie, and the whole mythology of Frankenstein. There's even a Dracula kind of reference in the movie too. So there's a lot of thinking that has gone into the hows and whys of this film because John McLoughlin was given free reign, as you know, to write and direct the movie. So this was not a guy who just, as we know in the kind of the past couple movies, came in and somebody was working on a script and then someone else was working on a script and whatever. This is a guy who his agent said to him, look, they're offering you this, and you've done one terrific genre movie, One Dark Night, which is a kind of a forever keeper, right? I mean, that's just in my view, his great movie. But you should just
I still haven't seen that. I got to check that out.
Just the best PG-rated horror film of all time, in a movie that had no ad campaign, was made for little money and got traction out in the market. It's a cult favorite now, and it really is. Again, to me, it's in the holy grail of 80s horror films, and I go back to it, 3 or 4 times a year, and certainly that's a movie that features a lot of really fascinating stuff. Again, the idea of monsters and the reanimation of monsters. A great performance from Meg Tilly, who stars in the movie too. So there's a lot going on with John McLoughlin. He's got street cred as far as horror films are concerned. And so to take this movie, when he was offered it, his agent said, "Look, you should take the movie because you're in a pretty good position to write and direct it, and you might be able to do something different with it." And I think Paramount was open to that because it was sort of anything but what was done by Danny Steinmann last time out. So let's kind of restore this to to a different place. And so Tom McLoughlin really took that ball and ran with it. And to understand the what built this movie, really, you'd have to understand his background, right? The stuff that we talked about in his, work as he lived in France for a while as a kind of pantomime artist. And of course, Dick Van Dyke had a second television show that he had a bunch of guest stars on. And he came on and did pantomime on that show. And before he knew it, Dick Van Dyke kind of liked him and gave him a job directing on his show for people like Lucille Ball and Carol Burnett and Freddie Prinze. And these people were all, he really was in the entertainment industry and thought of himself as a comedy/horror type guy, and had a lot of comedy scripts floating around. And then this horror thing came along, and he said, well, gee, maybe I'll make this horror film and put a lot of comedy in it because I wanted to do some comedy. So I think, that's kind of a long way of saying that I really admire the filmmaker, the writer as well, and it's the same person, and all the stuff he tried to do in the movie. And it's really fascinating, and as well as I do, that when you talk to directors of any movies genre, and tell you, look, this made me think of this, and this is how it ended up in the movie, and this is where, it's a part of my life and how I incorporated it in, and so all the stuff, Tom McLoughlin talks with such affection about this movie that he was thinking about even, for example, Frank Capra and Lawrence of Arabia and so many other. Even Frank Capra gave him feedback on One Dark Night, believe it or not, and so this was a guy who knows his stuff, and he's been in the industry, and he knows everybody, and he wanted to make a different type of movie and kind of stretch the formula. And I think he achieved that, making something different. And so when he talks about allusions in the movie to Buster Keaton and things like that, I totally get it. I just think there's something about the movie that didn't grab me. But as Gene Siskel said, the late great Gene Siskel, look, it's of the most offensive franchise in history, it's the least offensive entry.
Wow, I didn't know he had said that. That's great. That's wonderful. And when you say that he'd had all those influences outside of the horror genre, and this really is a different feel for it. It's almost like what James Cameron did with Aliens, coming off of Alien, taking the basic premise and saying, I'm going to turn this haunted house movie into a war film. Yeah. This really is kind of that version of it, from Jason's resurrection and just basically becoming a killing machine. In the previous movies, you can kind of buy that he's just this unstoppable, almost like a wood-dwelling creature. But in this one, his skin is gray and it's all deformed, and he's basically a walking corpse that's half melted. So there's no real humanity, or you can't put on his mom's sweater and talk him down from slicing you open in this one. And I really liked that aspect of it. The whole resurrection in the opening of when the cemetery with Tommy and Hans, fresh out of the asylum trying to kill Jason because, Tommy's like, if I burn the body and quote unquote send him to hell, that'll stop the hallucinations, right. Which it almost gives like a supernatural connotation to that too, which is if there is some grand force that is conspiring to bring Jason back, maybe it's a trap somehow for Tommy to lure him into bringing him back to life, which also gets me back to my question that I raised last time is, I can't remember, I think we said it was like 5 or 7 years between young Tommy hacking Jason up and killing him to his resurrection in part 6. Which opens up the question, what has been going on around these campgrounds? One of the things that's been going on is it became a destination for corporate paintball retreats.
Go ahead.
Well, the other thing that I thought would have been, if it was a slightly different kind of movie, or it had more time for this, the idea that Jason's gravesite, if he is this legend that the adults are old enough to believe and be afraid of, and the kids, almost like that Freddy Krueger type of thing, where they're young enough to not have experienced it firsthand, but only through stories, Jason's become kind of a legend. I just feel like his gravesite would have almost been like a tourist destination, especially if things had been quiet for that long.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you say that. And of course, I think in this movie, the idea of Jason is really more of an urban legend than something that's taken on fact. And so there's some kind of myth making about whether Jason ever really existed. And the movie kind of plays with the time structure. Again, we don't really know how near or far it is to the events of the other movie, although, certainly Tommy's close in age to where he was in the other film. But yeah, I mean, so the idea of the gravesite being a tourist attraction, I mean, hey, that's not a bad idea for a reboot, an opening scene of a reboot of this franchise. But yeah, I mean, it seems that for as large as his sort of aura in the community of Camp Crystal Lake looms, I mean, the only people who ever pay attention to him are the people in this very small sphere of the Friday the 13th world. It's like Tommy Jarvis is the only one. You'd think that the grave would be desecrated or that it would have been robbed up to this point or something like that, right? But I think he's been left alone. And maybe it's just because people either don't believe it's true or they just think it's a myth, right?
Yeah, or, moved or something because they changed it to Camp Forest Green or whatever the community is now because, as Sheriff Garris says, they want to forget all about Jason. I would think that they would have, put the body somewhere else or buried it in a government vault, kind of like they do in Jason X, which we'll get to eventually. I want to jump ahead a bit because I had a question at the end of this film, which never struck me until watching it this afternoon. At the very end, Tommy figures out through, I guess, reading occult literature that the best way to kill Jason is to return him to his original burial place, which is Camp Crystal Lake. Chains him to a rock and chains the thing around his neck, and he's submerged in what I guess is about 6 feet of water because he's able to just reach up and straight up grab people who are at the surface. Right. But at the very end, he's just hanging there, suspended, and he's still alive. Why didn't anybody think to go and grab his body from the bottom of the lake? I mean, unless they think that Tommy really did kill all those people, then someone would have to believe that somebody did all those murders, and it's Jason, and he's right there. Like, go get him.
Yeah, I know. You're trying to apply logic here.
I know. I do that. I do this every time I walk into the same trap, but I just feel like Tom McLoughlin was so smart in planning everything out, from the mythology to the dialogue to all the wit and the sight gags. Yeah. The one kind of airplane moment that I thought was in this movie was when they pass by a sign that says speeding and there's like these goofy question marks all over. I'm like, right. It's a bit much. Yeah. But I just feel like that last detail of him being under the lake and no one really caring, like, because it's clearly the next morning that this is shown and he's still down there. I can imagine if it's like the police, kind of like the opening of part 4, where the ambulances come and take everybody away, and then you cut over to the lake and he's still down there. Maybe they haven't had the time to say, hey, let's investigate what's down there. But this is the next day. I don't get it.
I know. I mean, I always just sort of assume that it's symbolically that spot is like kryptonite for him, right? That as we learn, if we go back to the source, he's going to lose his power and influence, and so therefore, technically, he's harmless at that moment. Or he should be harmless because he's been returned to the source of his death, right? So I think that's the intention. But I mean, you're right. It's like why wouldn't they take that body out of the lake and do what they would with it? And I think it just is more dramatic the way it ends with that eye opening, of course. For us, but yeah, I mean, I don't. When you take me down these logic alleyways, I'm not sure how to.
I'm not expecting an answer because, as you rightfully point out, every time I come up with a crazy conspiracy theory or an unanswerable question, you say that's a crazy conspiracy theory and an unanswerable question. So,
I mean, there's a lot of conspiracy theories going around these days, so we can just add any of these onto the pile, I guess. But you know what? I mean, I think these movies kind of live or die on their cast in a way. Like, and Tom McLoughlin said, look, if you hire actors who engage the audience, they're likable, and they have some degree of empathy about them that you want to empathize with them, even if it's like a little bit, you can, you'll like the movie because you'll be interested in who's on screen. And I guess, I wasn't interested in them. And I thought, I like Tom Matthews because I like him in Return of the Living Dead and Dangerously Close, one of my favorite 80s movies that he's in. So it's kind of fun watching him in the movie. He's a good-looking leading man, so that's fun too. And Jennifer Cook is plucky, I guess, in a way. But I'm always kind of referring back to the gold standards in the series, right? Like the like Ginny Fields, people like that who, if we were to just like stack these movies up, like who's engaging and like who really grabs you in these movies, and like what do they do, like what kind of inner life do they have that makes you like them. You know, look at like Amy Steele and the intensity of that. You know, she plays that real all the way through, and then we compare that to, and this is not a knock on Jennifer Cooke, I mean, these are different movies, different years, different points in the franchise, whatever. Like either it happens or it doesn't. You feel like they're plastic or they're not, and in some of the movies they don't really feel plastic to me, not because they're better written, but because the actors are just have a little more on the ball. And I feel that way, of course, about Melanie Kinnaman as well, and Adrienne King, who was the kind of quintessential 70s kind of just cool girl. But these characters feel to me plastic. So when we look at the friends, the other counselors, who just are kind of colorless in a way. This is when I say, despite all the thinking and the veer into different tones and the attempts to elevate the movie in a way, at the end of the day, they just feel sort of like off the shelf to me, the people doing. And I thought it was interesting because you said you really like Jennifer Cooke playing, the lead character, a final girl. In a way, because the final girl is really Tom Matthews, I guess, although, both of them kind of take on Jason together in a way. So she's not given a lot to do like a traditional final girl. And so she's kind of an interesting character because she saves his ass in a way. And she calms the kids down. And she's kind of funny as the rebellious daughter in a way, but it's kind of a weird character because it doesn't exist in the realm that a lot of the other women in the movie do. And I didn't really, because of that, I guess, I never really felt she was that much in danger. Somehow I didn't feel as attached to her.
She does have this almost, because I guess she's the sheriff's daughter, but she has almost like the preacher's daughter kind of thing where she's like kind of a wild child. She almost feels like the kind of character who would have been one of the victims, one of the early victims in another movie. She's fun, she's flirty, she's kind of sassy, whereas the other, leading ladies, survivor girls we've had in the other films tend to be more serious. I mean, I think the most lighthearted we get compared to Megan Garris is probably Ginny. Because she's, slamming back beers at the bar with everybody, and she's kind of giving her boyfriend shit. She's a fun character. Megan Garris is a fun capital FUN character. I think Tom McLoughlin plays with Jennifer Cooke's kind of bubbly personality, at least as portrayed in this movie. They really work well together, even in moments that are just kind of eye-rollingly awful, like when they're in the red Corvette, they're being chased by the police, and Tom Matthews is down between her legs, and she says, "Yes, hold tight, this is going to be a hairy turn." And I'm like, oh God, no.
No, so it's like two steps forward, one step back, every time. So yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, like my favorite two in the movie probably were Tom Fridley, Travolta's nephew, who plays that character of Colt, and then the other one, Darcy DeMoss, who we talked about a little bit last time, who was supposed to be in part 5, but unfortunately wasn't, because she had that run-in with Danny Steinmann that ended up meaning she wasn't going to be in the movie. So she started all over fresh in this one. And so as we're like reaching for things to love in a movie like this, their scene in the RV is pretty fun. So there's something funny and cool about that. And when I said it veered into PG rated territory, you got to give credit to those two actors for having a full-on sex scene while they're both, which is the first time that's ever happened in a Friday the 13th movie, as far as I know, or did happen. So there's something engaging and fun about those two. And so it's not that I dislike the cast or anything like that. I was looking for different things to catch on to, because I didn't really feel the visceral feeling in the movie, the visceral thrill. And I think the tone of comedy, and this is a personal thing for me, is never quite set well in movies. I argue all the time about with this, who loves this in American Werewolf in London, Return of the Living Dead, and so many other movies that blend comedy and horror in a way that he feels is really seamless. But for me, even though Tom McLoughlin will say, look, if you can get an audience laughing, you can get them doing anything. You might scare them or make them feel something else. Like once I think that the filmmaker has tongue-in-cheek in a way, somehow it deflates the horror element of the movie for me. So when you mentioned earlier the sequence with the paintballers out in the woods, which was, of course, the way that Jason accumulates his weapons. It's kind of a logical way to accumulate the weapons early in the movie. That kind of stuff for me really jumps the shark of a horror film, because I lose my anxiety, because I know it's like a joke, that there's a lot of joking going on, and so therefore something gets lost from me. So I felt a lot of that in this movie, that there's a lot of jokery, which is intentional. So it's hard to knock that, because that's, sometimes, you have to measure a movie on what did they intend to do and how well did they do it. And this is what Tom McLoughlin intended, and he did it pretty well. I would just say, for me, those intentions don't really work. And so this movie is kind of up and down for me because of those tonal things,
I wonder if the reaction might have, because I felt the same way watching it this time. I wonder if our reactions might have been different if this movie had not been as heavily censored as it was. Because I know the triple decapitation, for example, was supposed to show more gore, the actual heads flopping down with the bodies. I wonder if that kind of punctuation of graphic violence would have helped sell the kind of comedy going along with it. Because you're right, with these characters walking through the woods, complaining about, corporate sales, and, one of them, being an executive who's a woman, who that actress, I don't remember her name, but she really reminded me of Elizabeth Warren for some reason. Maybe she just looked a lot like her, and she kind of had that spunk. And then, of course, you cut to the one guy who she shot, who's like a total misogynist, like, she should be back in the kitchen. I'm like, well, there you go. It's like Elizabeth Warren and the antithesis of Elizabeth Warren. Yeah. But that scene does go on kind of forever without a whole lot of payoff. And even the little wiry character that is the one that they're all kind of looking for, who's kind of escaped their notice until Jason sees him and runs after him. He's got this minute-long scene, which doesn't sound like a long time, but in terms of a horror film, a minute, especially when you're just watching him do this Bugs Bunny crawl through the woods and up trees and stuff, it just goes on forever, and it's not really funny. I understand he was one of Tom McLaughlin's like mime buddies. The only thing that kind of entertained me is that this is the first time I caught that his name was Roy, which is the name of the fake Jason from Part 5. And when we see him hacked to death, we see the revelation of his body parts, kind of like we did with Roy's son in Part 5. So I don't know if that was intentional or just a nice little happy accident, but it was catharsis for me. I'm like, well, now I have a reason to be interested in this scene, because otherwise, I guess it's cute. They've got this gag with the headbands that all say dead when you get shot. That's nice, but aside from adding to the body count, it doesn't add much.
Yeah. See, I knew there was going to be a theory coming up, and you just did make a theory about Roy. Look, so let's just boil this down to the fact that we can agree that it's a thriller, it's a horror film, right? So at the end of the day, it has to do some things that horror films are supposed to do. It has to scare us. It has to take us on a horror film kind of ride in a way. It has to have some feeling of menace in it. I would argue that all the stuff we're talking about aside, like the tonal stuff and the new stuff that was tried and so forth, put it all aside and just ask the basic question about whether this particular installment has any frightening moments in it. And I would argue no. I don't think there's a moment in the movie of genuine suspense that's built. I mean, some might say, okay, so Jason's hiding in the RV at one point, and he does pop out in the RV, and there's that super cool shot of over the Darcy DeMoss over the top of the bathroom, which is in the bathroom with him. But in terms of building what I think is the stock and trade of Friday the 13th, which is some sequences where, there's a crazy killer kind of hiding in the shadows, or someone is defenseless, and they're gonna get it. Like Marcy in the first movie, for example, she's in the bathroom kind of looking in the mirror, and someone's behind that little curtain that keeps going back and forth. I mean, there are instances in all the movies like this. This movie doesn't seem to really have many of them where genuine anxiety or terror takes place. It all seems to me so artificial. And even if we just said, okay, so maybe I'm wrong, and the horror element is not exactly what's necessary, but the gore element is necessary. Even the gore element in this movie is pretty tame. There's really nothing to write home about or anything that's gonna shock anybody who's seen any slasher movie, let alone the 5 movies that precede this. If you look at the deaths in the movie, so Tony Goldwyn gets thrown over Jason's head with a spear near the beginning of the movie, and and then Elizabeth McLaughlin, which is Tom McLaughlin's wife, gets speared in the puddle. But some of the deaths even seem to be not very explicit. I mean, we see the aftermath of them. Of course, we have the staple again of the room filled with blood, which we've talked about, that comes up in this movie. It's really filled with blood in this one. But some of the stuff, like pulling someone out of a window, or and I know the MPAA saw this movie 9 times, and they had to trim the movie, so some of the stuff didn't make it in. I don't think the movie has enough terror in it, and it doesn't have enough gore in it. So if the comedy was all there and those things were there in spades, it would be a different experience for me. But I just never felt scared or anxious by any of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean the one, it's not exactly a counterpoint, but I mean I agree with you. It's not scary is the wrong word. I think when I was really young and I first saw this like on cable and I'm trying to like hide from my parents that I'm watching it, kind of a thing. There's some stuff that really. Yeah,
that was the best way to do these. Yes.
Yeah. But there was like the opening scene in the cemetery where they would, cut to the lightning striking, and not on Jason, but you'd see the flashes on those creepy little angel statues in the cemetery. A real nice Gothic kind of way to open the film, which is also a mirror to the opening of Part 5 with these people kind of digging up Jason, but this time it's not a dream. I think what it lacks in gore and actual terror, it kind of makes up for in inventiveness. Like, even though we don't get to see everything in the triple decapitation, it's a triple decapitation. That's pretty cool. Darcy DeMoss's face gets shoved through the RV and comes out the other side in that wonderful kind of like bending plastic effect. I liked the one deputy or the cop who gets his face, Deputy Pappas, I think, gets his head squished like a grape. And watching the Crystal Lake Memories doc, you get to see the rough of the uncensored version where you see his brain kind of like pop out of the top. That's that's all good stuff. I wish that was in there. But as much as I gotta fault the movie on not being as gory or as scary as some of the other ones, I do kind of like the inventiveness and also the other elements that I mentioned before, the heroism, the addition of children to the movie. And I gotta say, this is, I guess, maybe kind of a fourth point, is in terms of caring about the characters, there was the girl who got ripped apart in the cabin. We just see the aftermath of it. I can't remember her character's name. Was it Nancy or something? But she was
Nancy's little girl.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's Nancy, a little girl. Okay. The counselor who kind of befriends Nancy and tells her, if you see something scary, just close your eyes, say a prayer, and they'll be fine. And then she goes back to her cabin. Jason jumps out of the door, and then we see a struggle through the outside of the cabin window, and she gets thrown, a splash of blood against the window, and her body comes flying through and then gets like ripped back. I remember as a kid watching this, and I talked about this with my 12-year-old friends at the time. We were devastated that she got killed, especially in such a brutal fashion, because she was the quintessential good girl. She's almost like she would be the final girl in any of these other movies. She's not drinking or having sex or getting high. She's just very nice and kind of wholesome, and she really seems to care about people. But she almost gets it worst of anybody in the film. There's a sense of brutality there. And so that's one of the reasons I think I like this movie, is I do care, or at least McLoughlin is able to show on some level, getting back to the roots of these are real people, and sometimes you just run up against pure evil in life and you have no control over it, and it's going to do terrible things and leave you with scars or a funeral. I did appreciate that bit of realism in a hyper unrealistic movie.
Yeah. I would agree. I wanted to build on something you mentioned a minute ago, that the movie is very high on atmosphere in some of its scenes. And when you talk about the Gothic look of some of the stones in the cemetery and so forth, I mean, McLoughlin was pretty clear that right from the opening moment of the movie, he wanted to establish a sort of a place that was rich in atmosphere. So the sweeping of the fog through the cemetery, the wind through the trees, the rain, and all this feeling that you could immediately sort of establish the movie in the opening shot, like the feeling of the movie. And I think that's sustained through the movie. And one thing you can notice when you see this movie is that when you look, even for example, at the way the cemetery is lit at the beginning, and even the way that the woods are lit at certain points, I mean, this is a much more sophisticated lighting style, and it looks like, even though it was made for $3 million, it still looks like a bigger budget movie than some of the other ones were, and it has a scale to some of that stuff. I mean, it wasn't really necessary to do that stuff. Like, for example, fully light as they did some of the whole of the cemetery. I mean, you could have easily just lit the area by the grave. We saw that happen at the beginning of part 5. Remember what the scene with Corey Feldman's in the backyard, where it's just that moment at the grave. But this particular version, Tom McLoughlin went to the trouble aesthetically to make it more cinematic, just by giving it a glossier look and a more ambitious look. And so I think, even though I mentioned the horror and the gore being a little diminished, I think he worked hard on the atmosphere of the movie to make sure that went over really well. And I think the way the camp is shot as well, like the cabins, the lake, that's all very effectively shot, and it's kind of a welcome return in a way to the camp setting, because for the last couple of movies we've been absent from that sort of setting for the last 3 movies prior to this. And so I got a kick out of that, like going back to the camp in a way, and going back to the lake. And it was very interesting to see, by the way, the children at the camp, which was the first time that it had ever been done, where the kids had actually shown up or had been at camp, because it usually always precedes the arrival of the kids. But this time we have the kids there, and one of them who's made a character in the movie, and that very interesting thing that Tom McLoughlin mentioned, which I would not have picked up on my own because I'm not sure it's conveyed well, but that the girl says kind of a prayer where she speaks about God for a minute, and then Jason allows her to live, the young girl. And so there's kind of moral fabric to what goes on in that moment that hasn't happened in the movies before. So this is, again, one of those many touches in the movie that's different than the other movies, and something Tom McLoughlin just tried his hand at doing because he could.
Talking about the kids, I'm thinking another web series I would like to see is just the adventures or the misadventures of a kid back in the 80s who his parents kept trying to send him to camp, but like the week before he's supposed to show up, everyone just ends up getting killed.
They keep sending him again.
Yeah,
I mean, honestly, but that environment is really well evoked here, the environment of the summer camp, and I get a kind of a real thrill anytime I see these films, and they do well with the log cabin aesthetic of the little cabins down by the lake and so forth, and this one does pretty well with that.
Yeah, and there's a shot that I'd forgotten about where Jason actually, he's making his way from the deep woods or whatever back to the camp, as Tommy predicted he would. And there's a great shot of him walking into the camp, and you can tell it's supposed to be a fully functioning kids camp at night. It's very well lit. It's almost like a main avenue into the cabins. And as he walks under that arch, you can see that there's that sight gag of like integrity, friendship, trust, loyalty. It's practically a daytime scene. He's not hiding in the trees or skulking around the edges of the cabins. He's going right down the main stretch, which is kind of a boldness that we haven't really seen before, I don't think.
Yeah, because it's his land. It's his home, and he owns it. And he's shown us in 5 movies, prior that anybody who gets in the way there is going to suffer the consequences. And so he just boldly walks through the front, and there's kind of a fun shot where I think there's a sign there, and on the sign on the left side of the frame, there's a bunch of sports, for example, that are going on, and he just kind of passes right through, which I thought was pretty cool. Also, let's talk a little about the casting in the movie and the jump to Thom Mathews in the role, which the series has always just decided that at the very basic level, the only thing that matters is that there are hot young people that get killed, and so everything else is superfluous. Whether we recast roles, whether we fudge on the time frame, whether the location looks like the desert of California or the lush East Coast, or in this case it's Georgia, where they shot it. And so everything else is always up for grabs. It doesn't really matter. You could just write a totally new story, recast roles, kill off people that managed to survive, in the film before, whatever it is, not even answer for people who disappeared at the end of a movie prior, as you know, and a couple times we just don't really know what happened to them. But there was an attempt at the beginning of the production of this movie to involve both Melanie Kinnaman and Sheva Ross for both of their roles, Reggie and Pam, back from Part 5, and as a matter of fact, Melanie was signed for the role also, and then they ended up going in a totally different direction after she had already signed for it. And even John Shepherd was courted to come back, and as John Shepherd tells it, look, he asked for a bunch of money to go back, and then suddenly he was out. And as Tom McLoughlin tells it, Frank Mancuso Jr. didn't want John Shepherd in the role, so who knows what the real truth is to the whole thing. But John Shepherd, as you know, is really a person of deep faith, and was on the fence about continuing his acting career after Friday the 13th, or going into a seminary, I believe, and so, or to become a pastor is what he was going to do, and he chose the latter after this incident where he wasn't cast in this movie, and so, you know, really we're just starting all over. I mean, and there was an intention to cast those actors, and then that fell through, so they just decided, you know, it doesn't really matter, and it just speaks to the randomness of the stringing this together, which is really a fly by the seat of the pants series in a way, and so as Tom McLoughlin tells it, and Frank Mancuso would say, look, I mean, you know, these movies were cheap. They were $2 and $3 million, and they would routinely make, you know, this one made 19.2, which was a pretty low number, and the other ones made more than that. But still, 19.2 on a $3 million budget is still a massive hit if you think about what a hit is in terms of making the money back in the production and advertising costs. So every time these movies would open, even though they'd say the final chapter or whatever they might say on the Monday morning after the release date, just say at Paramount, look, do you want to do another one, Frank? Yeah, let's just do another one. Okay, start working on another one, because, you know, they knew that they were going to make money. So that was just, you know, I don't know if what other movie franchise, and, you know, you could say is as haphazard as this one in terms of stringing things together, but at least it gives us something new and different every time out, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the casting goes, I know there was also a story about, as you mentioned, Sheva Ross was going to come back as Reggie the Reckless, but his father, I guess, vetoed his being in the movie because he had read the script and Reggie was supposed to die. So I don't know if this was going to be like a part 2 situation where, you know, yeah, everybody shows up and maybe Melanie Kinnaman and Reggie the Reckless both get like killed at the outset, and then Tommy, you know, goes out to avenge their deaths, or what the deal was. You know, ostensibly they would have been picking up right after Part 5, so you wouldn't have to deal with this whole necessarily resurrection of Jason, you know, 5 or 7 years later. I'd be very interested to know what that script was like. But as far as the casting goes, yeah, I do like, you know, Todd Matthews in the role. Darcy DeMoss, who we kind of talked about earlier, I'm surprised she just didn't leave the production, because in Part 5, yeah, she was kind of sexually harassed by Danny Steinmann, who had basically said, you know, take off your clothes. And she's like, no, I'm not going to do that. And then in this movie, Tom McLoughlin came to her because someone had pointed out there's no nudity in this movie. And he's like, well, I guess you're going to be the girl. And he said, would you be okay doing topless? And she's like, nope. And it's not in my contract. So, I mean, yeah, she did, she was, you know, yeah, she was a trooper and everything, and she did it. And it's, you know, a very memorable character and a memorable scene, but I would just feel so kind of, you know, demoralized. I mean, yeah, I guess it's great that people want to see her naked, but it's almost like, do I have any value beyond being someone that people want to see naked? The answer is yes, because I think she was great in this movie and also Can't Buy Me Love. I don't know. And just talking briefly about those diminishing returns, this movie did come in at a quote unquote disappointing 19 million. And the speculation is because people were so upset about Part 5, they just didn't bother with this until, you know, home video. But then after this movie, quote unquote, underperformed, even though it kind of became a cult hit later on, they didn't make another one of these for like a year and a half. Like, these were on a new Friday every year. It was like the Saw franchise 20 years later. But then they took this weird break between Jason Lives and A New Blood.
Yeah, I mean, you know, honestly, I think this was just viewer fatigue, right? And so it was like, what's going to be new? I mean, there really is nothing that exciting and brand new in these. We're like kind of grabbing at straws, and we're talking about the director's approach is this or that, or Danny Steinmann was this way, Tom McLoughlin was that way. But to the average audience member, a lot of that stuff is behind the screen, behind the scenes. It's not in the movie. And so they're just saying, look, I've seen teenagers getting killed over and over and over. And there is such a thing as aging out of a particular audience segment that has been your bread and butter as they are no longer 17 and they're 24 or 25, and they kind of have seen it. And the novelty of it is worn off. So I think when we get into things like, Jason being in New York City, Jason being in outer space, things like that. I mean, this is an attempt really to the novelty of to try to say, look, we're trying to do something totally different to get a new audience. But I think that's what was going on with this movie. And as far as Darcy DeMoss is concerned, I mean, we would have to look at the moment in American movies for young actresses when this came out in the early 80s. The premier image kind of young women was in teenage sex in the movies, unless you're lucky enough to be in the top echelon of young actresses who weren't doing that stuff. But even the great actresses that we remember of the era were going topless. It was Phoebe Cates in Fast Times at Ridgemont High. It was Jennifer Jason Leigh, of course, that very same film. In so many movies, I mean, nudity was just of the job in so many movies, and the idea of the body double was of the job too, because nudity was so much more prevalent in the movies in the 70s and 80s. So Darcy DeMoss was right in the crosshairs of that era where this was a normal thing. Like you would have, I mean, especially part of a Friday the 13th movie. So to stand up and say, look, I'm not going to do it because Phoebe Cates is my friend as she was, and she regretted doing it. And she always said it hurt her career. So I'm not going to do it. I mean, it's not built into my contract. I think there was some issues as well related to Danny Steinmann's handling of what many of the cast members and many who reflected back on Part 5 thought of as a step up from a porn movie. And certainly that followed Danny Steinmann through his career because he was, he made a porn movie when he was younger to kick things off. And he carried that level of sleaze. And I say that in the best sense of the word because I love Friday the 13th, Part 5. He carried that through. And so I think they were like, let's just not do it this time. Let's take it a little bit of a different way, right? So that, Darcy DeMoss was kind of a hero for doing that in that way, I think, and sticking to her guns. And Tom McLoughlin, I think, is a pretty nice guy who just asked her nicely, I think we're going to have you do this. And she said no. And he said, okay. Yeah. And so they ended up doing it. And I think that suggestion came from Don Behrens, who we haven't talked to either, who was the producer on the film, was either a production manager or a producer on Halloween. So he had some horror movie chops too. But, was just, I think, a cleaner shoot simply because it was pendulum swinging back from what had happened in the fifth one. And I will, whenever I hear criticisms of the fifth one from people who are in the franchise, in the fifth or the sixth, I always kind of cringe because this is Friday the 13th. It's like sex and death and naked people and blood and like skulls being smushed. I mean, this isn't PG land. So I admire Darcy DeMoss for sticking to her guns, but it's Friday the 13th. Come on.
I totally get it. I'm kind of surprised that I don't know what the climate or whatever was like for an actress who, at the time, as you mentioned, wanted to be in the movies but didn't want to take her clothes off. The fact that she was able to actually get that in her contract and have nobody notice or inform anybody, oh, she check her contract, we can't hire her, she's not going to take off her blouse. But yeah, it's almost like a story I'd like to hear like the full version of. But and it's not necessary because as odd as it is kind of, she is very sexy in the part, and I think you achieve everything that you need to, and it's almost like an iconic scene. She's got the rock and roll kind of the big hair and that black blouse, and later she puts on the jean jacket. It almost looked weird just to see her bouncing up and down topless. I don't know. Maybe it's just because I haven't seen it. I can't imagine it.
I think the whole thing is just very fascinating to think about how culture and movies have changed, and certainly the era of the early 80s where every movie from Porky's forward, from Porky, the higher profile ones, Porky's Last American Virgin, Hard Bodies, these were the A-list ones. We could go down to all the Z-grade ones, but it was just sort of a thing that you did if you were a young aspiring actress, and you might even do it in a movie that had some merit to it. Like I saw recently the new Blu-ray of Just One of the Guys, a movie I adore from the 80s, and I just have a real affection for him. Joyce Heiser, who's a completely independent character in that movie, as you know, she's a high school would-be budding journalist who's not taken seriously because she's a woman, so she pretends to be a man at a neighboring school, and then suddenly she's taken seriously, and there's all this fun interplay, battle of the sexes of the time interplay. But even at the end of that movie, she in order to prove her identity, is forced to disrobe in front of this young guy who's become her best friend. And that nude scene that Joyce Heiser did followed her through her kind of entire career, because it was like Phoebe Cates' moment, an iconic nudity moment. I think, Mr. Skin would have, written about this and loved this, because this was really one of the big nudity moments. And it was an event. It could be an event if an actress did nudity, and it could follow you for a long time. And I'm sure Darcy DeMoss was smart enough to know this, that like this will be like a calling card if I do this. And so she just chose not to do it. And she's just as sexy in the movie anyway. So
yeah, it's so weird now. Maybe because of the ubiquity of pocket porn and all of this other stuff. I'm like, if you've seen an actress take off her clothes, why do you need to see her, do that in any other movie? I mean, you've got that one thing, just let her act, But, this is 30 years ago. So, and I can't believe I'm saying that because.
Hey, I wanted to mention C.J. Gramm playing Jason, who really has just his own, like, novelty of a story too, because this was a non-actor who owned a nightclub, and through the circuitous route of knowing some people from the former Friday the 13th crew movie, came into his club, and suddenly they asked him, hey, would you like to be the person playing Jason? And the Jason guy, I think his name was Mike Bradley or Ted Bradley or something like that, who was cast originally as Jason in this movie, just ballooned up in his weight. He ate a lot and got, really heavy. And then I guess, as the story goes, Frank Mancuso said, look, no way, this guy's out. And so they offered it to this guy. C.J. Gramm was an ex-Marine and really just jumped into the role, and with the complete discipline of a Marine who knows how to follow orders, did everything that Tom McLoughlin asked him to do, and all the stunts himself, with the exception of one where the RV flips over. And so everything we see in the movie of Jason being burned on fire, being drowned underwater, this was all C.J. Gramm, and not a stunt guy doing this stuff. And because of that one performance that was sort of accidental for a non-actor, he became part of the lore of Friday the 13th. He's certainly at the conventions and so forth. He does a really interesting job with the movie, and they really tried to craft him as a Frankenstein type character in his sort of hulking, lurching sort of movements. And interestingly, the direction that was given to him by Tom McLoughlin was, this is Jason as the Terminator, or the Terminator as Jason. And so that's the physical sort of imposition we want you to have in every scene, was what Arnold Schwarzenegger did in The Terminator. And so if you watch the movie looking at it that way, it's kind of interesting, the things he would do, the way he would move and turn and look. It's kind of almost robotic in a way. And so I think he did a great job in that role. This was before, of course, Kane Hodder came on and took the role over, but nonetheless, a pretty good Jason.
He's a very good Jason, and I am looking forward to talking about New Blood next month, because that is Kane Hodder's debut, and he was, the guy for the next several films. From what I remember, his big thing was showing Jason breathing. He's not just a zombie. He's a guy who has somehow still functioning lungs and everything, and that was his contribution to the menace. But you're right, with C.J. Graham's military background, Jason is not only just robotic, but he almost has this sort of militaristic sentry movement. Like when he's marching through the grave site or the graveyard after he's picked up the lightning rod and he's just kind of stalking through the woods, he's carrying it like he should be standing in front of Buckingham Palace or something like that. And then I also noticed, speaking of this Terminator kind of thing, I think it's the first kill after he comes back to life, aside from Horshack, the couple driving, it's Nancy McLaughlin and why can't I think of his name? Tony Goldwyn. He gives Tony Goldwyn more chances than Jason has ever given anybody in the history or the movies that came after this to get out of the situation. Because he stops the car, he puts the spear through the car, through the tire, which is odd because then she tries to reverse. She's like, we're going to just leave. I'm like, how are you going to go anywhere with a flat tire? But he gets out of the car with his gun. He points it at Jason. I think he fires a shot, and then he fires another shot, and then Jason spears him. I'm like, they're having a whole basically conversation before Jason does anything, it's almost like he's thinking, you're standing on the exact boundary of Camp Crystal Lake. So if you step one toe over this line, I'm going to have to kill you, but you still have a chance to go back. It's very odd to me.
Yeah. It's very odd. I mean, it's just funny to see Tony Goldwyn in that because, of course, he went on to a pretty good career. Sometimes we think about actors in Friday the 13th not having gone on to do a hell of a lot. Afterwards, Tony Goldwyn certainly went on to become an actor and a director in A-list things, and is still out there today, like Kevin Bacon did, of course, as well. And so he's pretty good in the movie, in that little tiny scene. And I think it was his first movie. It was the movie that he got his Screen Actors Guild card on. So it was really his first foray into acting. And I don't know what he. I haven't read that he's reflected back on it at all or had any real thoughts about being in it. Although certainly, he is, as you're talking about, given a moment there. It's kind of like the moment that Vera has in part 3, where she's able to kind of stand face to face with Jason a little bit before she actually gets it. And Ginny has a moment like that too. But yeah, I mean, mostly the movies are all about the jump scare slash in the moment and the special effects of the moment. And so there aren't a lot of moments like that where the character has a chance to kind of stand face to face with Jason. And I'm not sure if any of the movies ever really has taken it a step further to have what would be fascinating, which is the character contemplating mortality in that moment. It usually always happens so fast. Like this, that it's over, but there is a little bit of an extra beat in that moment also. So that's pretty cool. And then it's followed by that moment that I've never quite understood, which is the floating of the American Express card in the puddle, which was, I don't know if I was supposed to laugh at that, and Tom McLoughlin in the audience yell out, "Don't leave home without it," which I find kind of hard to believe, but nonetheless, I'm going to take him at his word for that. So the floating of the Amex card was an intensely difficult shot to get, and I don't know why it was necessary.
It's a sight gag, and yeah, he said that he thought someone in the audience would yell that out, which maybe they did. But for me, when I first watched it with my friends, we all thought it was kind of odd. But I guess it's the idea that she was going to try and pay off Jason, because at this point she doesn't know that it's him. She may not even be aware of the whole Camp Crystal Lake legend. She just says it's a strange guy in a mask, and that's never a good sign. So maybe she thought, I killed your boyfriend, and now I'm gonna menace you, but hey, if I give you $50 on my Amex card, you'll leave me alone. I don't know. It was a weird sign of desperation.
Yeah, it's a weird moment where she offers him money. I mean, I guess it's just another departure, kind of a funny sort of moment. I mean, I want to mention also something interesting that Tom McLoughlin said, because this movie would test screen ahead of time, right? Mm-hmm. By very nature of the test screening, you have to kind of cater to what the audience wants. And I think the kills, the additional kills were added after the test screening, where people just felt it wasn't scary enough or didn't have enough death in it. And then the couple in the woods on the date and the cemetery caretaker, that all was added, and it was a reshoot sort of later. But Tom McLoughlin said something just from a movie industry perspective, from a director's perspective. It's interesting. He said, look, the test audience is a pretty terrible thing, because basically the producers will just want to do whatever the test audience says. So if one person in the audience reacts in a certain way, like laughs at a certain thing, everybody in the audience will start laughing, just because it's a communal thing. And it may not be that everybody in the audience really wants to laugh or feels the same feeling that the person who first felt, but they just sort of as a community do this. And so in the test screening of this movie, I think the feeling was that it was funnier rather than scary, and they ended up having to go back to put those in, because the thinking is always, look, put those 3 kills in, and we'll make an additional $15 million at the box office if that. And so this movie was test screened and then altered afterwards to add those additional kills, which the novelty of 13 kills in a Friday the 13th movie went out the window, which was Tom McLaughlin's idea. And so the movie was sort of beefed up. I would just argue that the kills weren't really that explicit, and they were so quick. I'm not sure they really added anything to the movie. But at any rate, what's your favorite death scene in the movie? What do you think is the most effective one?
Probably a combination of Darcy DeMoss getting her head rammed through the RV, and then also Officer Pappas with the head squishing thing. I thought that was pretty cool. But I do want to say that those reshoots that were done, I guess, at Griffith Park, the couple that was on the scooter, they get double impaled by a machete, and I don't know if this is an issue of the censors, or if it's just an issue of the time, but it was a really odd camera angle. You know, the only way you can really tell if they both got speared through is that you see a little bit of blood come out of the girl's mouth. That's just, that's rife for, that's a really spectacular set piece if you think to pull it off. But it does smell of a reshoot. It's like, okay, we got, a day to do these 3 deaths. We got to get in and get out, and, who cares? The other, the one thing I do want to touch on in terms of the direction this movie could have gone, which I think possibly would have just frustrated you to no end, considering how you feel about the whole mythology and this getting away from the roots of Friday the 13th, was the original proposed ending, in which the caretaker character does survive to the end of the movie, and he shows up at the cemetery, I guess, after Jason's been put back in his place, or maybe that's still just Hans's body in there. But it's Elias Voorhees, Jason's dad, and there's some storyboards. There's some storyboards in the documentary where it's like, they don't really talk about the dialogue, but you kind of get the idea from these sort of comic book panels what is going on, and it seems to end with a close-up of Elias Voorhees kind of like looking really closely at the camera, I guess mirroring back to the eyeball shot of Jason at the beginning. And it's just, they try to do this with Halloween years later, where it's like Michael Myers was not just a soulless killer, he was part of a cult that was engineered by Thorne or something. I'm glad they didn't go that route, but I'd be very interested to find out what the hell they were going to try and pull off. Like if McLoughlin had secretly written a new Jason trilogy, or if it's just like the whole J.J. Abrams thing where I'm just going to leave this and the next person can figure it the hell out.
Can figure it out, right? The whole idea is just, I don't know whether they were thinking, look, we got many more movies to go, let's get creative here with like what's gonna come next. But that would have been a little weird, because the whole thing, when you go across the history of movies about mommy complexes from Psycho forward, and there may even be movies I'm leaving out before Psycho, but there are so many of them, the Norman Bates template, right? The father's not doesn't figure or factor into that psychology or psychosis, and so I think that would diffuse the notion of the mother-son relationship in this movie, and it would just become something in the series, and it would become something totally different and unnecessary. And to be honest with you, like sometimes I think like just stick to what works. Like let's just build some good suspense. Let's put some new people out in the woods. Let's have some directorial ingenuity around how to build some suspense. The Italian directors knew how to do this. Like the Giallo directors, you look at Argento, you look at Fulci, you look at so many of them from the era. They knew how to build sequences of suspense. Knew how to use the camera and cinematography and the staging of set pieces, and I'm not saying they had lavish budgets, because they didn't, but they were ingenious about staging death sequences. If you looked across Argento's movies, you probably would not find, there'd probably be impalings and things like that in the movies, but they're ingeniously done. They're different, and I think this is the challenge in these movies is if we could just get some good directors who have some ingenuity around how to build suspense and craft original sequences, then we would have we'd have something, you'd be able to breathe life back into it in a way, like Kevin Williamson and Wes Craven did when Scream came just not too many years later. You really were reinventing it in a way and doing something ingenious and scaring people. And I think these movies decided somewhere along the way that they didn't really want to scare people anymore. They just wanted to adhere very strictly to killing people. I think it's a big difference between killing people and scaring people. And that's why I think at certain times that the Friday jumps the shark in a way, because it forgets the essence of what makes a horror film for the audience, which is that we want to feel jumpy. We want to feel on edge in the movie. And yeah, we get startled in the Friday the 13th movies, but I don't think the caliber of directors is what it maybe could have been. And maybe that's because some of the really good horror directors said they didn't want to work in Friday the 13th or otherwise, which is not a knock on some of the movies that I think are effective and the sequences that are effective, but I think they got lazy, and the directors got lazy, and that's when the series kind of starts to fall apart, which we'll talk about like coming soon. So I just feel like strongly that, you need a good director to build a horror sequence because everything's kind of been done in these movies. When you talk about the double impaling on the motorcycle and the squishing of somebody's head, which has been done 3 times now and has been done out of Friday the 13th and other movies. And, you really got to either go back to the drawing board and say, what are some new ways to kill people? I mean, or do it in some different way. And I think the movie gets a little lazy in that way, for me.
No, I totally hear it there. I think it was interesting that I guess Kevin Williamson drew on this movie as an inspiration, or he really liked it a lot, and he actually sent Tom McLoughlin the script for what was then called Scary Movie, and McLoughlin passed, and Wes Craven ended up directing it and kind of resurrecting his career. The other, as far as titles go, this movie was originally called Jason Has Risen, which I guess Paramount was not too thrilled about because it's kind of probably the religious connotations, but even that suggests the tongue-in-cheek kind of attitude that was going into this movie. And you're right, it's not a scary movie, it's a roller coaster movie. Down to the girl in the cabin who gets ripped apart. She's doing that thing where the door flies open, she's reaching to close it, nothing happens, she goes to close it again, and Jason's there. That's a jump scare. That's not suspense. That's not like the real feeling of mortal danger, in an audience or stuff that we're actually afraid of. But as much as I kind of wish there was some of that in here, I do also think it's a really well-built roller coaster. Certainly, at least it doesn't stray too much into conceptual goofiness, which we will talk about next month.
Yeah.
And then even worse in August. Wow. Yeah.
It was sort of interesting for me to go back and look at this movie because I tend to, when I watch any Friday the 13th, it's from 1 to 5. And I watch them frequently. I'm probably watching one of them every week that's in the 1 to 5 realm. And I hardly ever go 5, So I'm reinstilling some discipline around due diligence on this series by doing this with you. And I'm really excited about some of these movies to come because I haven't seen them in a long time. And I'm telling you, they're going to be fun. So I think by the time we get to some of the later ones, this one's going to look so much better in retrospect. So anyway.
I predict it will at least be, if it's 6 of 6 right now, it's going to be, maybe 6 of 12 come the end of the year, something like that. Yeah.
So, hey, are we going to talk about the remakes at all when we get to the end? Maybe we'll cover the remakes, right?
Yeah, because I mean that's how we're able to do the full year is because there were 11 Fridays, including Freddie versus Jason, and then December will be Friday the 13th, 2009, which was a monster hit. But then, thanks to some lawsuit action, we haven't seen one in over a decade. So that'll be fun times.
I know it'll be fun times. So I don't know what else there is to say about this movie, but I think comparatively, it's upbeat and it's the PG-13 version of Friday the 13th. So
very much so, and part of that upbeatness is Alice Cooper's, I think, wonderful "He's Back, the Man Behind the Mask," which I'd never noticed until this afternoon. It actually shows up in the movie 3 times. It's on the boombox, it's in the Corvette, and it's also at the end credits. I'm like, geez, Teenage Frankenstein only got 1 showing, and that was the RV sequence, I guess. So
I guess Graham actually appeared in the music video for Teenage Frankenstein or something like that with Alice Cooper, so he got to spend the day with him. So that was pretty cool. But Tom McLoughlin was enamored of Alice Cooper, so that's why that that became what it was.
Yeah, and thank goodness, because it's a great video with a little bookend with the weird Alice Cooper turns out to be the dad of the kid who wants to go camping. I don't know, but thanks again for talking Friday the 13th for Friday the 40th with me. I can't wait to find out what you think of The New Blood, not The New Beginning, but The New Blood next month, because that was sort of a favorite of mine growing up. I haven't watched it in a long time, so I'm kind of afraid to see where I land on that one. But it's going to be nothing if not a fascinating conversation.
Yes. Shall I tell you right now?
Yeah. Tell me now, because we're going to have another crazy month where 1,000,003 things are going to happen in the real world, and I will have completely forgotten your opinion by the time we talk.
I think it's great. I think it's criminally overlooked. So anyway, more next month.
Are you being serious or tongue in cheek?
More next month. I'm being tongue in cheek. Come on. This is Friday the 13th, but you know what? Hey, I want to say one thing though. We've got to just always be mindful, and people never are mindful like this. And sometimes I think, as a critic, like we have to flip a switch in our brain, because objectively, if we just decided to apply like critical principles to these movies, we would just throw them all out. We would say, oh, these are just trash movies. I mean, top to bottom. Okay, so there's levels of trash, and so whatever. Let's, none of them are any good or whatever, the rap on these movies. But we have to look at them as number one, horror films. And there's different rules that apply. So we need to look at them through that lens. And of course, through that lens, some of them qualify as pretty damn good horror films. So we have to look at them as they stack up against all the other movies in their series, right? So I think we have to apply different criteria to them. And no one's ever going to accuse any of these movies of being, they're not going on to AFI's top 100 movies of all time list, or going in the National Film Registry, as it were. But as horror films, I think it's a mistake critically to throw the baby out with bathwater, because there's a lot of great stuff. And arguably, if we had a serious discussion about this, these movies have survived for decades and will continue to survive and be embraced and be talked about and be watched and attract big crowds of people at conventions, including this movie and the one we're going to talk about next month, and many of the other better movies that were critically well received across the decades. Nobody can remember. Nobody can even remember, what won the Academy Award 10 years ago. But everybody can remember, Kane Hodder, for example, who we'll talk about next month. So,
I'm in agreement, and it's almost a full conversation we could have another time. Maybe we will. But my stomach I get really queasy when people try and dismiss genre films, or, oh, it's just a slasher movie, or, oh, it's just a teenage skin flick or whatever. I mean, the fact that you've got prominent directors who make quote unquote legitimate films referencing back to some of these genre pictures as being very formative or informative, or they got their start, like James Cameron, Academy Award winning director, started working for Harvey Korman on 50-cent budget movies. You've got Martin Scorsese talking about the influence of Mario Bava in Blood and Black Lace. It's I think I don't turn off my critic brain ever. I do understand that the filmmaker intent, or maybe even the point of the genre is, I'm not going to come away thinking, big things about life or whatever. I accept a movie on its own terms. And I think people have to do that, especially, sometimes snooty critics who get so far up their own ass, they can't even, enjoy anything anymore. You can appreciate something for what it is and take it apart critically, and also praise it, to say that there are some great artistic flourishes and ambition in Friday the 13th Part 6 that you can't just write it off and say, oh, it's another Jason movie. Oh, they're out of ideas. No, there's some great ideas in this movie. However you feel about, whether or not they're effectively executed, that's another matter. But you can't say that the people making it didn't really care about trying to do something, different.
Totally. And I think if at the end of the day, we have to always remember that this was a team of artists that made this movie. I mean, they didn't only make Friday the 13th in their careers. They went on to do lots of other stuff. Maybe they didn't win Oscars, but they directed other movies. They acted in other things. They had in many cases, long careers. And Friday the 13th was a blip for them. And they have as much fun laughing about it as we do as well. And so we have to remember how difficult it is to make movies, first of all, and that any movies get made and get financed is just a Herculean endeavor, regardless of the movie. If it's a low budget movie that costs $2, or if it costs $200 million. So the idea that as critics, we need to outright dismiss things that fall into exploitative genres and their B movies and drive-in movies, when in fact people spent years of their lives like mounting these movies, financing them, acting in them with some degree of realism as much as they could, polishing them, and if those movies found audiences, and in many cases were highly profitable, much more profitable than the average Hollywood movie would be, simply because costs were kept down and they found their niche audience and were able to make money in drive-ins or wherever they played. This is, it begs a question about what really a successful film is at the end of the day. If audiences love it, if it makes money and is profitable, if it lasts for 50 years and people are still having a good time with it, watching it and going to conventions to meet people in it, that's a pretty damn successful movie, regardless of whether we apply highbrow critical tenets to it. So we always have to remember that. And once someone told me that, I'd lent Suspiria to them, the great Argento Suspiria, and they said, look, I turned it off after half an hour because the dubbing was so bad. I just couldn't get past it. And I was so disappointed that someone would say, that was a reason to not watch it, because that was intentional. I mean, that was not a chief concern. It was mood, it was atmosphere, it was color, it was mise en scène, as they say. It was all the artistry of the filmmaking. The dubbing was just an afterthought. I mean, people spoke in different languages, and then they were dubbed later. It was just a given in these types of movies. And so I think we have to be very careful about the criteria we use to evaluate different types of movies from different genres and different backgrounds. I mean, I could go on and on about this, and when I do my lecture groups, I do go on about it. And we look at, for example, foreign language films and the things that French cinema can get away with in dealing with relationships. For example, relationships are told in shorthand. They're told in emotions a lot of times. They're not told in full backstories or full character motivations, or we don't necessarily get three-dimensional characters where we know everything about their lives. We sometimes get the bones of the intensity of the feelings in the relationship, and we think that's great. Sometimes a great French film or a French love story relationship. When we did that in American movies, we would say, look, it's not fleshed out enough. We don't know enough about the people. It's not developed enough. But because they're different movies from different cultures, we have different standards of evaluating them. We need to do that with genre films too. And so that's why what I always say. Anyway, yeah. It's one on a monologue.
Well, no, I appreciate that I have a fellow combatant in the kind of the culture war is a bad phrase to use, but talking about defending genre. I know Patrick Bromley is also kind of with us in that spirit, and that just because someone has there's a knife on the poster doesn't mean that it's you can just skip it. So yeah, I'm there with you. Yeah, we should talk more about this on another show. So, but for right now. I will say thank you again for talking with me about this, and we'll be back next month for Carrie versus Jason.
You won't want to miss this one.
All right, take it easy, man.